Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world where even blinking too often could ruin your reputation. A place of lace gloves, suffocating corsets, and etiquette rules so bizarre they made daily life feel like a full-time performance. Forget fairy tales of sweeping ballrooms and candlelit romance. The Victorian era was more like an endless audition, where one crooked step, one laugh too loud, or even one slightly enthusiastic bite of dinner could brand you a social disaster. Before we get started, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you actually enjoy these sleepy journeys through history. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing this little time-travelling community stretch across the world. Now dim the lights, settle in, and maybe loosen your waistband a little. Because tonight, you're tightening yours far too much. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 1865. The good news? You're part of polite Victorian society. The bad news? Polite Victorian society doesn't allow you to sit, speak, or even breathe without an etiquette manual supervising. Your day begins not with coffee, but with the corset. You're laced in so tightly your ribs are reconsidering their career choices, and your lungs can only inflate about halfway. Forget deep breathing exercises. Those haven't been invented yet, and even if they had, you'd pass out trying. Your waist is squeezed to the circumference of a dinner plate, which sounds elegant until you realise you still have to walk, eat, and exist like this for the next 12 hours. Fact: corsets could be pulled so tight that fainting wasn't just a dramatic gesture, it was a daily hazard. Etiquette books didn't see this as a problem. Instead, they encouraged women to treat fainting like an art form. If you collapsed gracefully enough, you weren't weak, you were fashionable. Speaking, of course, requires just as much performance. You must never raise your voice above a gentle hum, never laugh in a way that shows your teeth, and absolutely never interrupt. Your words are supposed to flow softly, like embroidery and sound. Unfortunately, you're running out of oxygen from that corset, so most of your sentences end in a light wheeze. Perfectly acceptable, as long as you wheeze quietly. Walking is its own ordeal. Arms at your sides, back straight, chin level, steps small and deliberate. Swing too freely and suddenly you look common. Trip once, and you've not only embarrassed yourself, but possibly your entire family line. That's how much weight etiquette carried. Manuals actually recommended practicing with books balanced on your head, because nothing says refinement like pretending you're a mobile bookshelf. Even eating isn't safe from scrutiny. Every bite must be tiny. Your fork must never clatter against the plate, and whatever you do, do not look hungry. Hunger was vulgar. You're expected to cultivate an air of delicate disinterest, as though roasted beef and apple tart mean nothing to you, even while your stomach sounds like a church organ warming up. And as you sit there with a lace glove pinching your wrist and a teacup balanced in your trembling hand, you realise that the entire Victorian system wasn't built for comfort. It was built for control. You weren't just surviving the day, you were surviving a never-ending audition for the role of respectable woman. And one wrong step meant social exile, whispered scandal, or worse, pity. But if you think public dining and posture drills were absurd, just wait until you find out what happened in the private chambers of Victorian homes, where etiquette rules became even stranger and far more suffocating. And while your corset squeezes you like an overstuffed sausage casing, there is another invisible grip around you that feels even tighter: the rules of posture. To exist in Victorian society, you are not simply required to stand, you are required to stand correctly. That means back straight, shoulders aligned, chin slightly raised, and arms neatly contained in their invisible prison at your sides. The act of holding yourself upright was treated less like a natural position, and more like an ongoing exam where one misstep meant instant disapproval. Victorian etiquette manuals were ruthless about posture because they believed it revealed a woman's character. A slouch was not just a slouch. It was an admission of laziness, poor breeding, or even moral weakness. The obsession went so far that women were instructed to train their bodies through constant drills. Walking with books stacked on your head was not a schoolyard gag. It was a genuine exercise promoted in guidebooks and finishing schools. If the books fell, your future marriage prospects did too. The absurdity lies in how much symbolism Victorians attached to something as basic as sitting. A woman who perched too comfortably on a chair risked looking coarse. Etiquette guides instructed her to only sit on the edge, never leaning back fully because reclining was seen as too familiar. Imagine living in a world where the way you rested your back determined whether people thought you were virtuous. Comfort was secondary. Appearances ruled. And appearances extended into the realm of walking itself. Gait was everything. A Victorian lady was expected to glide, never stomp, shuffle or swing her arms. Manuals actually warned against moving too quickly because it betrayed eagerness, which was considered unladylike. Even crossing a room required precision, with small steps that looked elegant but bordered on impractical. Walking outside was worse. The uneven cobblestones of London or the mud of rural lanes made elegant gliding nearly impossible, but the rules demanded it anyway. Society was less concerned with reality than with the illusion of grace. The obsession with appearances had measurable consequences. Doctors in the 19th century recorded that women often developed spinal and muscular problems from the constant effort of holding themselves in rigid poses. Instead of acknowledging the harm, many physicians reinforced the idea that physical weakness was a feminine virtue. They claimed that women's delicate posture proved they were naturally suited for lives of refinement rather than labour. In other words, being visibly uncomfortable was considered proof that you were doing womanhood correctly. At meals, posture rules reached their peak. You were required to sit upright with your elbows locked close to your body. Leaning forward to cut your food was discouraged. Instead, you had to bring the fork and knife toward yourself with minimal movement. This created a spectacle where eating became less about nourishment and more about performance art. Manuals even warned against chewing with any visible enthusiasm. You were supposed to look as if you were barely interested in the food, even when you were starving. Hunger was vulgar. Restraint was elegance. The link between posture and morality might sound absurd now, but to Victorians it was deadly serious. Etiquette writers argued that a woman's body was a public display of her soul. If her back slouched, then so did her morals. If her chin dropped, it meant her character did too. That logic sounds like a cruel parody, but it was written into hundreds of etiquette guides that circulated through Britain and America. These books sold widely, which meant the rules reached into drawing rooms, boarding schools, and even across the Atlantic to influence how women in other countries behaved. It is worth remembering that these rules were not only about control, but also about competition. Middle-class families who had recently gained wealth often clung to etiquette as a way to prove they belonged in higher society. A woman's posture became her resume. If she could master the delicate art of appearing rigid yet graceful, she carried the stamp of refinement her family desperately needed. It was less about personal comfort and more about broadcasting social class through her vertebrae. Picture yourself trying to live under this constant gaze, your waist compressed until breathing feels like a privilege, your spine forced into an endless performance of rigidity, your steps calculated to the inch so that your skirt does not swish too eagerly. Even the simple act of lowering yourself into a chair becomes a choreography of restraint. The result is that you are never at rest. Every moment is a small performance, every gesture an audition for approval. And while you're adjusting your shoulders to appear graceful, there is a new rule waiting to trip you. It does not concern your posture or your steps, but the very sound of your voice. Because in Victorian society, how you spoke was just as dangerous as how you moved. And while your spine is trapped in its never-ending audition for elegance, your voice becomes the next battlefield. Victorian society did not simply care about what you said. It cared about how you said it, when you said it, and how long it took to come out of your mouth. Speech was not communication. It was a performance, and every word was judged for its pitch, tone, and pacing. Etiquette manuals drilled home that a woman should never raise her voice. Loudness was considered a masculine quality, a sign of unruly behaviour. A lady's speech was meant to be gentle, almost musical, floating lightly into the air without ever appearing forceful. If your voice carried too much strength, people whispered that you were unladylike. If it carried too little, you risked being dismissed as weak. The sweet spot was a narrow window, a balancing act that left women second-guessing every syllable. The absurdity becomes clearer when you realise that laughter was equally regulated. Smiling was encouraged, but laughter was dangerous. Etiquette guides warned against laughing with your mouth open, or in a way that exposed too much of your teeth. It was thought to show a lack of refinement. Instead, women were urged to cultivate a soft, delicate giggle, a kind of controlled exhale that would never echo through a room. In practice, this turned moments of humour into staged performances where your ribs shook but your lips barely parted. Conversations themselves were also carefully patrolled. A Victorian lady was expected to be engaging but never dominating. She could respond but rarely initiate. She could answer questions but not pry too deeply. The manuals insisted that women should avoid controversial subjects such as politics, religion, or anything too intellectual. These were considered men's domains. Instead, approved topics included weather, compliments, and harmless observations about the beauty of the surrounding decor. Imagine having a mind full of thoughts, but being confined to polite commentary about wallpaper patterns. Even the rhythm of speech was codified. A woman was told to avoid speaking too quickly, as it suggested nervousness or lower breeding. She was equally warned against speaking too slowly, which gave the impression of sluggish intelligence. The result was an artificial cadence, each sentence measured like the ticking of a clock. You were not just talking to people, you were proving word by word that you knew your place in the hierarchy. The connection between speech and morality was no accident. In Victorian thought, a woman's voice reflected her character. Softness indicated purity. Restraint suggested obedience. Anything that veered outside the approved boundaries risked tarnishing your reputation. This moral policing turned the act of speaking into yet another form of social surveillance. Your friends, neighbours, and even strangers were listening, not for meaning, but for correctness. Historical accounts show how deeply this logic ran. Period magazines gave detailed examples of how to respond in polite company. If someone complimented your dress, you were expected to deflect modestly, never showing pride. If someone insulted you, retaliation was forbidden. Instead, silence was advised, with the idea that quiet dignity would shield you from disgrace. In other words, etiquette demanded you absorb social blows without protest. Speaking up for yourself was considered far more scandalous than being insulted in the first place. The irony is that silence became its own language. To remain quiet at the right time was seen as graceful. Too much silence, however, made you look cold or dull. It created an impossible loop where every choice carried risk. A single sentence could raise suspicion. A poorly timed pause could sink you just as quickly. Women were essentially forced into conversational limbo, never fully free to speak and never fully safe in silence. This pressure reshaped not just conversation, but the very spaces where conversation happened. Drawing rooms became stages where women performed their roles before the audience of society. Whispered exchanges at balls, tea table banter, even the act of answering a question from a visiting relative became part of the endless etiquette theatre. And just like posture, the point was not efficiency or honesty. The point was to prove that you belonged to a class that valued appearances above all else. Now imagine yourself under these rules, corset already pressing the air out of your lungs, and realizing you cannot even release a proper laugh without risking disgrace. Your sentences come out measured, shallow, and carefully framed. You're not simply speaking, you're rehearsing a role, one that society demands you play for the rest of your life. But speech was only one part of the performance. Next came the art of dining, where every bite of food was another test, and even hunger itself became something you had to disguise. And once your voice has been properly caged in whispers, and your laughter pressed into a polite little flutter, the next battlefield is the dining table. Eating was never a simple matter of satisfying hunger in the Victorian age. It was a carefully choreographed ritual where the wrong movement of a fork or the wrong tilt of a glass could undo months of social manoeuvring. Hunger was treated like an embarrassing secret, and food itself became an instrument of judgment. Etiquette books instructed women that dining was a moral act. It was not about nutrition or appetite, but about displaying refinement. This is why table manners were enforced with almost military precision. You were told how to sit, how to hold your utensils, how to lift food to your mouth, and even how to swallow. Nothing was left to chance. Manuals warned that eating too quickly showed greed, while eating too slowly suggested dim-wittedness. Women were expected to find the perfect rhythm, which meant chewing in small, silent bites, never letting a fork scrape against the plate, and never allowing a crumb to linger. One of the strangest details was how much attention was given to cutlery. The Victorians multiplied forks, knives, and spoons until dining looked less like a meal and more like a surgical procedure. Each utensil had its specific purpose, and picking up the wrong one marked you instantly as uncultured. A fish fork was not to be confused with a dessert fork, and heaven help you if you dared to cut salad with a knife. This obsession grew so intense that etiquette manuals included entire diagrams explaining the correct order in which to use the cutlery. The rule was always to begin from the outside and work inward, a system that has baffled generations of dinner guests ever since. Meals also included strict rules about conversation. Talking while chewing was considered a social crime. Complaining about food was unthinkable. Women were advised to remain graceful even if the meal was unappetizing, or if the portion left them hungry. In fact, showing visible enthusiasm for food was condemned. Manuals urged women to cultivate an attitude of gentle indifference, as though their survival did not depend on the roast beef in front of them. It was better to faint from hunger than to appear greedy. Even drinking was monitored. Glasses had to be lifted with the most delicate motion, and sipping too loudly could cause scandal. Manuals instructed women never to drain a glass fully in one sitting. To do so implied eagerness or even desperation. Instead, the correct method was to take small, quiet sips, placing the glass back gently between each one. Imagine trying to quench your thirst on a sweltering evening, while being expected to behave as though you barely noticed the liquid. The food itself was not always cooperative. Victorian cooking, while elaborate, was often heavy, greasy, and riddled with questionable preservation methods. Dishes of boiled meats, suet puddings, and vegetables cooked to mush made eating a delicate task. Cutting into a slab of overcooked beef while maintaining elegance was like playing a game of social survival. If the meat resisted the knife, you were expected to disguise the struggle. Effort at the table was not attractive. The ideal was to appear as though food surrendered to your fork willingly, no matter how rubbery it was in reality. And of course, there were endless rules about what women should not eat. Large bites of bread were condemned. Greasy or messy foods were dangerous because they could smear gloves or stain dresses. Even fruit came with instructions. Bananas and oranges were to be peeled and eaten with utensils, never by hand. Strawberries might be acceptable if daintily speared one by one, but anything that risked juice dripping was a liability. Dining was less about nourishment and more about rehearsing control in front of an audience. The irony is that while women were policing every gesture at the table, men were often allowed more freedom. Accounts from the period describe men piling plates high, drinking heavily, and speaking loudly, while women maintained a fragile performance of restraint beside them. The double standard was glaring, yet etiquette demanded that women accept it in silence, treating their hunger as invisible, while praising the appetite of men as a sign of vitality. This pressure even affected the design of furniture. Dining chairs were often narrow and upright, discouraging relaxation. Women were expected to perch delicately rather than sink back. Plates were arranged with more utensils than food, and the pace of service forced guests to adapt quickly. A dropped spoon or a misplaced napkin was not just a small accident. It was a social failure, whispered about long after the meal ended. By the end of such a dinner, women often left more exhausted than nourished. The effort of maintaining posture, controlling bites, choosing the right fork, and speaking in carefully measured tones was draining. It turned every meal into a theatre of performance where the audience was always watching. Even in private homes, the fear of doing something incorrectly lingered. Many women practiced at home, balancing books, rehearsing fork movements, and even staging mock meals to perfect their skills. And as the clinking of forks dies down and the candlelight flickers across the table, you realise that food was never the focus at all. The true meal being served was reputation, carved into tiny pieces and consumed in silence. Dining was less about eating, and more about demonstrating that you had mastered the art of denying yourself. Yet the rituals of the dining table were only one corner of this suffocating maze. Etiquette rules extended far beyond posture, speech, and meals. They reached into fashion, accessories, and even how women handled something as simple as gloves or fans. Each object became another instrument of judgment, another silent test of refinement, and another way to fail in the endless performance of Victorian womanhood. And once the ordeal of the dining table has ended, you're still not free. The theatre of manners follows you into the drawing room, into the street, and into every corner of your existence stitched directly into your clothing. Fashion in the Victorian world was not just fabric. It was a cage, a weapon, and a constant public report card. Every glove, every fan, and every parasol carried a message, and failing to use them properly risked more than embarrassment. It risked being branded as uncultured, unfeminine, or even morally suspect. Gloves in particular carried extraordinary weight. A woman was almost never seen in public without them. The glove was not just a covering for the hand, it was a symbol of modesty and refinement. To be bare-handed at the wrong time was akin to being undressed. Etiquette manuals scolded women who removed gloves too quickly, or forgot to wear them altogether. Even the act of taking them off had a ritual. They were to be peeled away slowly, finger by finger, and only in appropriate settings, such as before dining. Doing this wrong could be seen as vulgar. Something as mundane as revealing your wrist at the wrong time carried more scandal than most of us would believe possible today. Fans were equally policed. Far from being simple tools for cooling off, they became instruments of coded behaviour. In fact, the so-called language of the fan developed in the 19th century, a supposed system where the way a woman held or moved her fan sent signals to those around her. Covering part of the face with a fan might indicate shyness, while snapping it shut abruptly could suggest displeasure. Whether or not women truly followed this code in daily life, etiquette writers treated it as an essential skill. Manuals even included charts showing the meanings of different fan gestures, as though a woman were expected to be fluent in an entire second language of flicks and folds. Parasols also became loaded symbols. They were not only protection against the sun, but a marker of class. Pale skin was prized as a sign of wealth, since it meant you were not labouring outdoors. Carrying a parasol signalled refinement, but like everything else it had rules. The angle at which you held it mattered, as did the way you opened and closed it. Holding it too carelessly risked knocking into others, which was labelled clumsy and unfeminine. A parasol was supposed to float beside you like an extension of your body, graceful and perfectly aligned with your posture. Fashion itself created absurd burdens. Dresses required multiple layers including chemises, corsets, crinolines and petticoats. By the mid-19th century, skirts had expanded so dramatically with the aid of steel crinolines that simply walking through a doorway required strategy. Women sometimes caught fire when skirts brushed against open flames, yet etiquette guides rarely acknowledged the danger. Instead, they continued to emphasize grace, advising women to practice gliding even when their clothing weighed over 30 pounds. Comfort and safety were less important than maintaining the illusion of elegance. Even the smallest accessories became traps. Handkerchiefs had to be carried and used with delicacy. Etiquette books advised that a lady should never blow her nose noisily, but instead dab discreetly. Jewellery, too, carried expectations. pearls and modest ornaments were acceptable in the morning, while more elaborate pieces were reserved for evening. To wear the wrong item at the wrong hour was enough to draw criticism. The clock dictated not just your schedule, but the very stones you pinned to your body. The sheer expense of following these rules created enormous pressure. Middle-class families strained to provide their daughters with the proper wardrobes, since failing to appear fashionable could harm marriage prospects. Clothing became a financial investment tied directly to social status. It was not unusual for families to spend beyond their means to ensure that their daughters appeared in the right gloves, the right gowns, and the right accessories for each occasion. Fashion was less about personal taste and more about survival in a competitive social world. Historical accounts describe how difficult these standards were to maintain. Diaries from young women often mention the exhaustion of dressing for events, the pain of corsets, and the endless worry of being judged for minor mistakes. Yet these same accounts also show how women internalized the rules, often chastising themselves for imagined failures. The system was so deeply entrenched that discomfort was reinterpreted as elegance. To suffer in silence was the mark of refinement. Even men commented on the absurdity, though rarely in ways that challenged the system. Satirical magazines like Punch poked fun at the enormous dresses and the elaborate rules, but the laughter rarely translated into change. Women remained bound by etiquette that demanded they prioritize appearance above practicality. It was a cycle that reinforced itself, with manuals, magazines, and social circles all feeding the same expectation. Now picture yourself navigating a crowded evening gathering, your gloves fitted, your fan flicking lightly, your parasol leaning at the correct angle, and your dress ballooning outward like a mobile piece of architecture. Every movement is calculated, every accessory monitored. Even when the candles burn low and your feet ache from standing, you cannot relax. Fashion has made you into a display, and etiquette demands you remain flawless. Yet as heavy as these fabrics feel, there was another weight women carried that had nothing to do with clothing. The rules of social visits and calling cards were just as suffocating, turning the simple act of saying hello into a bureaucratic nightmare of rituals and unspoken judgments. And when the weight of silk, steel and lace has already exhausted you, the next hurdle comes not from what you wear, but from where you go. Social visits in the Victorian world were not spontaneous or relaxed affairs. They were elaborate ceremonies governed by a rigid system of rules that turned the simple act of calling on a neighbour into an ordeal worthy of a bureaucrat. The centrepiece of this ritual was the calling card, a small piece of paper that held the power to shape reputations and open or close doors. A calling card was not just stationery, it was a passport into society. Women were expected to carry stacks of them, each carefully engraved with their names, sometimes adorned with delicate designs or monograms. When arriving at someone's home, you never simply knocked and introduced yourself. Instead, you handed over a card to the servant, who delivered it to the mistress of the house. The card acted as a filter, allowing the hostess to decide whether she would receive you or not. The rules surrounding these cards were astonishingly complex. If you left a corner of the card folded, it meant you had delivered it in person. If you sent a card without folding, it meant the servant had delivered it for you. A folded corner could also indicate different occasions depending on which edge was bent. Manuals included entire diagrams to teach young women how to fold paper correctly, as though they were preparing for a secret society initiation. Misfold the card and you risked insulting the household. The act of visiting itself came with strict time limits. Staying too long was considered intrusive, while leaving too soon appeared dismissive. Etiquette books recommended 15 to 20 minutes as the proper length of a call, unless expressly invited to stay longer. Imagine travelling across a muddy street in layers of skirts and corsets, only to sit stiffly in a parlour chair for a quarter of an hour, making small talk about the weather, and then rising to leave before you overstayed your welcome. It was less a conversation than a performance of punctual restraint. Conversations during visits were also heavily restricted. Just as at the dining table, controversial or personal topics were forbidden. Instead, you were expected to make light observations about household decor, local events, or general pleasantries. Compliments were acceptable, but they had to be modest, never over-enthusiastic. Criticism of any kind was absolutely off limits. Even silence was policed. Remaining quiet for too long made you appear awkward, while speaking too much suggested self-importance. A perfect balance of meaningless chatter was the goal. The calling card system also enforced hierarchy. Those of higher status could choose whether or not to return a card, while those of lower status were expected to accept the slight without protest. Failing to return a card was a subtle way of cutting someone off socially, a form of rejection that carried enormous weight in a society where reputation determined everything. The thickness of your stack of returned cards was a visible measure of your acceptance into the social web. Some households displayed the cards they received as though they were trophies. Visitors could see at a glance which families were important enough to draw attention. This turned parlours into silent competitions, with cards spread across trays or arranged neatly on tables, a paper mosaic of alliances and rivalries. A single missing card could spark gossip. Why had that family failed to call? Had they been insulted? Were they distancing themselves? The drama was endless, and it all played out through little rectangles of paper. The absurdity is even clearer when you consider how much effort was poured into maintaining these rituals. Etiquette guides scolded women for careless handwriting or cheap paper. Printers advertised premium card stock as though it were a weapon in the battle for social survival. Failing to participate in the system was unthinkable, yet keeping up with its demands drained time and money. The calling card became less a tool for communication, and more a constant reminder that your every move was under scrutiny. Historical records showed just how consuming this could be. In urban centres like London, women often devoted entire afternoons to making rounds of visits, leaving cards at one house after another. Carriages clogged fashionable streets as women hopped in and out, dropping off tokens of their existence like bees pollinating a very judgmental garden. Those without the resources for a carriage struggled to keep pace, trudging in heavy gowns across uneven streets simply to leave a piece of paper that might not even be acknowledged. All of this etiquette served one primary function: to maintain the appearance of order and class distinction in a rapidly changing society. The Victorian period was marked by rising middle classes eager to climb into higher social circles. Calling cards and visits became a way to enforce barriers, to keep the social ladder intact. Women bore the brunt of this system, forced to memorize its endless rules, while balancing the physical demands of fashion and the social pressures of perfection. Picture yourself with aching feet, corset strings cutting into your ribs, a parasol balanced against your arm, and yet you're expected to smile politely while delivering paper slips that dictate your worth. The servant takes your card, vanishes behind a heavy door, and you wait in silence, hoping you will be received. The outcome is uncertain. A closed door could signal rejection, but a returned card in the future might reopen the connection. Nothing is ever final, and everything is exhausting. And as the door finally opens and you're led into the parlour, you realise that even here the performance never ends. The room itself has rules, the seating arrangements have meaning, and the very way you handle your teacup is being watched. The visit is not a respite. It is another stage, another layer of etiquette piled onto the endless performance of Victorian life. And when you finally step inside the parlour, you're not free to collapse into the nearest chair. Seating in the Victorian home was not a matter of comfort. It was a coded system of hierarchy, where every piece of furniture carried unspoken instructions. A sofa was not just a sofa, it was a stage. A chair was not just a chair, it was a signal of status. Where you sat and how you sat determined how others judged your refinement. The arrangement of furniture itself was designed to enforce these rituals. Parlours were often set up with stiff rows of chairs, delicate side tables, and an intimidating sofa meant for the lady of the house. Guests entering the room had to wait to be offered a seat. To sit uninvited was unthinkable. Even once invited, certain chairs were more appropriate than others. Manuals warned women never to take the largest or most central seat, as it suggested arrogance. Instead, they were expected to choose modest seating and position themselves with care. Posture did not relax once you sat. If anything, the scrutiny intensified. The parlour chair became a testing ground where a woman's refinement was put on display. You were to sit upright, feet together, hands folded neatly in your lap or resting lightly on the arm of the chair. Crossing your legs was condemned as vulgar. Leaning back too far suggested laziness, while perching on the edge implied nervousness. The only acceptable position was an impossibly balanced middle ground, rigid but graceful, as though you were a mannequin masquerading as a human. Even entering and leaving the chair had rules. A woman was expected to lower herself gently, never plopping down or making the furniture creak. Rising required the same care. Manuals emphasized that women should avoid appearing as though they struggled to stand, no matter how heavy the layers of fabric weighing them down. Every motion had to appear effortless, even when it very clearly was not. Parlour etiquette extended beyond posture into conversation and interaction. Women were expected to defer to the hostess, never speaking before being spoken to, and never steering the conversation toward themselves. If a guest was offered tea, she was to accept with gratitude, handle the cup with precision, and sip without noise. The teacup itself carried expectations. Holding the handle with 2 fingers was preferred. Extending the pinky outward, despite what later caricatures suggested, was frowned upon as affected and pretentious. Seating also dictated relationships. Married women might be placed in more prominent positions, while unmarried young women were often expected to remain in modest corners of the room, speaking only when addressed. The sofa became a throne for the hostess, while lesser chairs reinforced the hierarchy of visitors. The very act of being placed in a certain seat communicated your social standing. Where you were told to sit mattered as much as what you said once you were seated. The absurdity is magnified when you consider how much effort went into maintaining these appearances. Families often rearranged their parlours before visitors arrived, ensuring that furniture reinforced the proper hierarchy. Servants were trained to usher guests towards certain seats, subtly orchestrating the flow of the room. In this way, the parlour became less a living space, and more a stage set for ongoing performances of class and respectability. Historical etiquette guides even addressed what to do with your hands while seated. Folding them too tightly suggested tension, while letting them dangle was deemed careless. Women were told to rest their hands lightly, perhaps holding a book or piece of embroidery, to create the illusion of elegant occupation. Idleness was dangerous. Even while sitting, a woman had to appear purposefully engaged. Parlour games and music were often introduced as ways to fill the silence, but these too were weighed with etiquette. A woman invited to play the piano was expected to perform with modesty, never boasting of her skill, and never playing too long. Applause was polite but restrained. Everything was calculated to avoid excess. Enjoyment had to be shown, but only in measured doses. The result was a social environment that was less about relaxation and more about constant self-monitoring. The parlour thus became a mirror of Victorian society itself. Every object, every seat, and every gesture was encoded with meaning. A simple visit that might last half an hour carried layers of rules that demanded constant attention. For women, it was another reminder that their role was not to exist naturally, but to perform refinement endlessly. And once the parlour doors closed, the performance did not end. Beyond the drawing room lay an even stranger set of rules tied to courtship, where every glance, every step in a dance, and every exchange of a calling card was scrutinised as though romance itself were a public contract written in invisible ink. And when the parlour doors opened to the subject of romance, the rules multiplied until affection itself felt like a legal contract. Courtship in the Victorian world was never a matter of simply liking someone. It was a battlefield of etiquette where glances, gestures, and the slightest breach of decorum could tarnish reputations. Love was not private. It was a public performance scored by families, neighbours, and entire communities. Even the very beginning of courtship was ritualised. A woman could not approach a man or initiate conversation unless formally introduced by a mutual acquaintance. To meet without an introduction risked scandal, as though speaking to someone new was itself suspicious. Introductions often took place in drawing rooms or at carefully supervised social events, never in the street. Once an introduction had been made, the boundaries remained strict. Etiquette manuals warned women never to be overly familiar, never to call attention to themselves, and never to express interest too openly. One of the strangest features of Victorian courtship was the emphasis on eye contact. A woman was expected to acknowledge interest with subtlety. A prolonged look could be interpreted as encouragement, while looking away too quickly might seem cold. There was no winning. The language of the eyes was treated with the same seriousness as the language of the fan. Manuals even included advice on how to control one's gaze, as though pupils could be trained like obedient pets. Dances became the official arena for testing romantic potential. The ballroom was less a place for enjoyment than for negotiation. Dance cards were distributed to women, small booklets in which partners signed up for specific dances in advance. The order of names on the card revealed much about social connections. A coveted spot signalled approval, while an empty card suggested social failure. The act of filling a card was like filling a resume, one that would be read and judged by the entire room. Yet dancing itself was fraught with peril. A waltz, introduced in the early 19th century, was considered shockingly intimate at first because it allowed men to hold women by the waist. Etiquette writers spilled gallons of ink debating whether this physical contact was indecent. By mid-century the waltz was accepted, but it still came with limits. A woman could not dance too many times with the same man, lest it suggest impropriety. Nor could she refuse too many partners without risking offence. Each step across the floor was choreographed not just to music, but to unspoken social rules. Courtship outside the ballroom followed the same suffocating logic. Women were not permitted to walk with men unaccompanied. A chaperone was always expected, whether it was a family member or a trusted companion. Strolling through the park, which might seem innocent, became a public display of propriety. Holding hands was nearly unthinkable outside of an engagement. Even casual conversation while walking required careful restraint. Letters between potential partners were also tightly monitored. Many families required correspondence to pass through parental supervision. A woman writing too frequently or with too much warmth risked appearing desperate. Manuals even suggested guidelines for the proper style of handwriting, insisting that modest, flowing script reflected a woman's character. Love letters were judged less by their content than by their decorum. Passion might exist between the lines, but it was buried under layers of caution. The material culture of courtship grew around these rules. Gifts, for example, carried symbolic weight. Flowers were particularly loaded with meaning thanks to the Victorian obsession with florography, or the language of flowers. A rose might signal love, while a lily suggested purity, and a yellow carnation could signal rejection. Women had to be fluent in this floral code, reading bouquets like messages in a secret cipher. Accepting or declining a flower could alter the course of a relationship. The absurdity lay in how much energy went into ensuring that nothing appeared too direct. Romance was supposed to look effortless, but in reality it was a maze of restrictions. Women found themselves rehearsing reactions, measuring glances, and memorizing flower codes as though preparing for an exam. Even when affection was genuine, it was filtered through a haze of etiquette that kept everyone watching and judging. Courtship was also tied heavily to class. The rituals that governed romance for the upper and middle classes were inaccessible to the working poor, who often had neither the time nor the resources to maintain them. Yet etiquette manuals presented these rules as universal, reinforcing the idea that refinement itself was inseparable from womanhood. To reject the rules was to risk being cast as coarse or immoral. The social consequences of failure were immense. A woman who appeared too forward could be labelled a flirt, a term that carried deep stigma. One who appeared too cold might be deemed unworthy of marriage. Reputation was currency, and every move in courtship spent it or saved it. women bore the responsibility of keeping the balance while men were often given more leeway. The double standard ensured that women were judged more harshly for missteps, while men's transgressions were dismissed with indulgent shrugs. Now imagine yourself at a Victorian ball, corset pressing against your ribs, skirts dragging across the polished floor, a dance card dangling from your wrist. Every step you take is measured, every glance dissected, every name on your card a piece of public data. You smile, you nod, you move through the evening as though auditioning for a role you never applied for. Love may or may not come of it, but judgment certainly will. And as the music fades and the candles burn low, the scrutiny does not end. Once engaged, a woman faced a new set of etiquette rules for marriage preparations, where trousseaux, dowries, and even the way you wrote thank you notes became extensions of the endless performance. And when the courtship dance finally produced a promise of marriage, the performance did not ease, it only intensified. Engagement in the Victorian era was not the sweet pause between romance and marriage that it might seem today. It was another test of refinement, an extended probation period where both parties were scrutinized by families, neighbors, and entire communities. Every gesture was recorded in the invisible ledger of respectability. The proposal itself was surrounded by rules. A woman could not accept a man's offer without her family's knowledge, and in most cases the man was expected to seek permission from her father before proposing. To accept in secret was scandalous, and if discovered, could cast suspicion on the woman's virtue. Even the engagement ring carried layers of etiquette. Diamonds were popular but not universal. Many middle-class families opted for modest stones, often set in gold. Yet even modest rings were weighed for their symbolism. A ring that looked too extravagant might suggest vanity, while a ring too plain risked whispers about financial instability. Once engaged, the woman was thrust into the exhausting business of preparing her trousseau. This collection of clothing, linens, and household goods was expected to display not only her sewing skills, but her family's financial position. Manuals stressed the importance of quality over quantity, though in practice both were expected. Wealthier women filled wardrobes with gowns for every conceivable occasion, while even middle-class brides worked tirelessly to produce finely embroidered linens. The trousseau was not just a practical necessity, it was a public announcement of readiness, proof that the bride could clothe herself, furnish a home, and embody refinement in every stitch. Dowries, though not universal, still played a role. Families negotiated financial arrangements behind the scenes, often treating marriage less as a union of affection and more as an economic alliance. Etiquette demanded that women remain silent on such matters, even though their futures hinged on them. Manuals advised women to show modest gratitude for whatever arrangements were made, never questioning or appearing too concerned with financial security. The absurdity of it was clear. A woman's entire livelihood might depend on the outcome, yet she was instructed to pretend as though she barely noticed. The etiquette of engagement extended into daily behaviour. A woman who had accepted a proposal was expected to carry herself with new gravity. She was no longer simply a young lady. She was a bride-to-be, and her conduct had to reflect that elevated status. Too much excitement was frowned upon, as it suggested immaturity. Too little enthusiasm raised doubts about the match. The engagement period became a balancing act of measured joy, public modesty, and endless restraint. Even the length of engagements came under scrutiny. Too short, and people whispered that the couple had been reckless. Too long, and suspicion grew about cold feet or family disagreements. Manuals often suggested a year as the ideal period, though real life rarely fit this template. Couples found themselves trapped between social expectations and practical realities, their every choice dissected by the watching eyes of their communities. Wedding invitations themselves were governed by rigid rules. They had to be printed on quality paper, written in the third person, and phrased with extreme formality. No flowery expressions of joy were permitted. Instead, invitations read like legal documents, with stiff phrasing announcing that Mr. and Mrs., So and so requested the honour of your presence at the marriage of their daughter. Failing to follow these conventions risked branding the family as careless or unrefined. The wedding ceremony, far from being a personal celebration, became the pinnacle of etiquette performance. Clothing was dictated by class and fashion trends. White gowns grew in popularity after Queen Victoria's 1840 wedding, yet not all women could afford them. Still, etiquette manuals pressured women to wear white or at least pale colours, framing purity in fabric. Guests too were policed. Women were advised never to outshine the bride, while men were expected to wear subdued formal attire. Every detail was another opportunity for judgment. The reception carried its own maze of rules. Seating arrangements reinforced hierarchy. Toasts were delivered with restraint. Even the act of cutting the wedding cake was laden with symbolic meaning, a demonstration of unity performed in front of an audience. Women were expected to receive congratulations with modest smiles, never appearing overwhelmed or too giddy. The performance did not pause even for the sake of exhaustion. Historical accounts reveal how draining this was. Diaries of Victorian brides often describe the fatigue of endless fittings, the stress of preparing trousseaux, and the strain of living under constant scrutiny. One small slip could spark gossip that lingered for years. A bride who stumbled during her procession, who mismanaged her veil, or who failed to thank guests with proper phrasing might never hear the end of it. The wedding, meant to mark a new beginning, often felt like an exam where the only acceptable grade was perfection. And once the vows were spoken and the rice thrown, the etiquette did not loosen its grip. Married life carried its own arsenal of rules, from how a wife should address her husband in public to how she managed her household. The performance of refinement was lifelong, and the wedding was merely the intermission between one act and the next. And after the vows were spoken and the ceremony concluded, the household itself became another stage. Marriage did not free a Victorian woman from etiquette. It multiplied the rules until even managing her own home felt like hosting a performance. Domestic life was not about comfort, but about demonstrating refinement at all hours. The drawing room, the kitchen, even the arrangement of doilies on a side table, all became extensions of social judgment. The wife was expected to serve as the moral centre of the household. Etiquette guides insisted that her demeanour set the tone for everyone under her roof. If she appeared calm and graceful, it was assumed her home was orderly and virtuous. If she faltered, the entire family's reputation could suffer. The absurdity was that everything, from how she instructed servants to how she poured tea for guests, was framed as a moral act rather than a practical one. Household manuals of the 19th century revealed just how elaborate these expectations became. Writers like Isabella Beeton published volumes filled with advice on how to run a respectable home. The instructions covered everything from how to prepare meals on time to how to discipline servants without raising one's voice. Women were told to master everything, yet always with an air of effortlessness. The home was to appear smooth and harmonious, as though invisible hands kept it running, even when in reality it required constant labour. One of the stranger aspects of domestic etiquette was the emphasis on cleanliness, without the conveniences of modern plumbing. Floors were scrubbed on hands and knees, laundry boiled in scalding water, and chamber pots emptied daily, yet women were told to maintain a composed exterior throughout. A lady could never admit to the grittier side of home management. Manuals suggested that she direct rather than do, even though in many households, especially among the middle class, women had to perform much of the work themselves. The illusion of effortless refinement mattered more than acknowledging the sweat behind it. The dining table within the home carried rules just as strict as those at formal dinners. Napkins had to be folded in precise ways, cutlery polished until it gleamed, and seating arranged to reflect family hierarchy. Children were expected to behave with miniature versions of adult manners, a practice drilled into them from early ages. A noisy or clumsy child was seen not only as ill-mannered, but as a reflection of maternal failure. A woman's reputation could be damaged by the way her children chewed. Even the decor of the home was governed by etiquette. Lace curtains, polished silver, carefully arranged mantelpieces, all signalled refinement. But there were pitfalls here too. Too much ornament was condemned as gaudy, while too little suggested poverty or negligence. Women walked a fine line between tasteful decoration and overindulgence. The wrong choice of wallpaper could become a talking point for neighbours, proving that even your walls were not safe from gossip. Guests in the home triggered another avalanche of rules. Women were expected to receive visitors graciously, no matter how inconvenient the timing. Refusing a guest outright was considered rude. Instead, the proper response was to welcome them with warmth, offer tea, and engage in polite conversation, even if you were in the middle of laundry or nursing a child. The house had to appear ready for company at any moment, which meant women lived in a constant state of vigilance, never certain when judgment would walk through the door. Servants, when present, added another layer of complexity. A woman of the house was expected to command authority without ever appearing harsh. Manuals advised that instructions be delivered firmly yet gently, as though managing people could be done with the flick of a fan. Yet the reality was often chaotic. Servants quit, chores piled up, and tempers flared. But etiquette demanded that the mistress of the house maintain composure as though nothing ever went wrong. Historical anecdotes show how these expectations wore women down. Letters from the period describe exhaustion from endless duties, yet these same letters often scold their writers for not meeting standards. Women internalized the belief that any failure at home reflected a failure of character. They were trapped in a system where both success and failure brought scrutiny, leaving little space for authenticity. And beyond daily life, there were rituals tied to hospitality that turned even small gestures into moral lessons. Offering tea had to be done with precision, never overfilling cups, never spilling milk, and never clattering a spoon. Serving food required equal care. Portions had to appear generous but not indulgent. Refusing food from a guest was offensive, yet eating too much risked whispers. Every detail became another tightrope to walk. Imagine yourself balancing these duties, corset still squeezing, skirt still heavy, hands never free of tasks. You must ensure that the house gleams, that children are quiet, that servants obey, and that every visitor leaves impressed. Yet none of this can show on your face. To appear harried would be a disgrace. The performance must continue in silence, even when the weight of the stage feels unbearable. And just when you think the home is secure, the outside world intrudes again. Etiquette extended into public life, where women faced another labyrinth of rules about how to behave in the street, on carriages, and even in shops. Every step outside the front door became yet another chapter in the endless performance of Victorian womanhood, and once the front door opened, the rules did not stay behind. The street itself was a stage, and every step in public carried expectations. A Victorian woman could not simply stroll to the market or visit a friend. She had to navigate a complex choreography where posture, clothing, and even the direction of her gaze were under constant surveillance. The world outside the home was no freer than the parlor. Walking in public was one of the most scrutinized acts. Manuals instructed women to keep their eyes forward, never darting around as though curious. Looking too much at the scenery risked appearing frivolous, while looking too intently at people suggested boldness. Both were dangerous. A modest downward glance combined with measured steps was the approved method. Women were also warned not to walk too quickly, since speed implied eagerness or even desperation. Instead, they were to glide at a controlled pace, as though the uneven cobblestones and muddy streets did not exist. Crossing the street was another trial. In an era before traffic lights and paved roads, streets were crowded with carriages, carts, animals, and pedestrians. Yet etiquette demanded that women appear untroubled while navigating this chaos. Manuals suggested lifting skirts only slightly, revealing no more than the tip of a boot, even if mud threatened to swallow hems whole. To lift a skirt too high was vulgar, but to let it drag risked ruin. The result was a balancing act that left women with stained dresses but reputations intact. Carriages presented their own maze of rules. Entering required grace, never showing too much leg as you stepped up, and never appearing to need assistance. Yet refusing help entirely could be seen as unfeminine. Manuals advised women to accept a gentleman's hand lightly, as though their balance was perfect but politeness required the gesture. Once inside, seating mattered. Taking the forward-facing seat was often reserved for higher status passengers, while lower-ranking guests were expected to sit with their backs to the horses. Even in transport, hierarchy dictated position. Shops and markets also became theatres of etiquette. Women were advised to speak to shopkeepers with politeness but never familiarity. Haggling was discouraged for respectable women, as it suggested a lack of refinement, even though it was common among working classes. Handling goods too freely was condemned as vulgar. Instead, you were to wait for items to be presented, touch them lightly, and then make your choice with measured calm. Even paying was choreographed. Money should be handed discreetly, never flaunted or counted out in an obvious way. Public behaviour extended to companionship. A woman walking alone was vulnerable to gossip. It was strongly recommended that women travel with a companion, preferably another lady or a servant. Being seen alone on certain streets could spark rumours about one's morality, especially in cities like London, where entire districts were associated with disreputable activity. Respectable women were instructed to avoid certain neighbourhoods entirely, as though their mere presence might taint them. Even the act of riding public transport was weighed with etiquette. Omnibuses and trains became more common in the 19th century, but women were expected to maintain perfect composure inside them. Manuals instructed women to avoid looking out of windows too often, to keep their hands folded neatly in their laps, and to speak only in quiet tones. Eating or drinking in public was unthinkable. A woman who dared to take a snack during travel risked whispers of impropriety. Umbrellas and parasols, common accessories in the street, carried their own hazards. Manuals warned against opening them too abruptly, lest you strike another pedestrian, and advised women to carry them in a manner that suggested elegance rather than utility. Even protection from rain had to be refined. A soaked gown might ruin your day, but etiquette demanded you hold the umbrella gracefully first and effectively second. Historical accounts describe just how impractical these rules were. London streets in the mid-19th century were notorious for filth, with horse manure, rotting waste, and stagnant puddles everywhere. Yet women were expected to emerge spotless from these conditions, their clothing immaculate, their composure unshaken. To appear dishevelled was interpreted as a failure of character, rather than the inevitable result of trudging through muck. Satirical writers of the time mocked these contradictions, pointing out the absurdity of women floating through streets designed for anything but elegance. Punch magazine often published cartoons of overdressed women struggling through mud or battling unruly skirts in the wind. Yet the satire did little to ease the pressure. The rules persisted, reinforced by etiquette manuals, fashion magazines, and the constant judgment of peers. Now imagine yourself leaving your carefully arranged home, gloves fitted, parasol balanced, and skirts layered with enough fabric to upholster a sofa. You step onto a street filled with noise, smoke, and filth, but you must move as though none of it exists. Your gaze steady, your pace measured, your posture unbroken. Every action is monitored, every misstep an invitation for gossip. Even outside, in the chaos of carriages and market stalls, you remain a performer trapped in the theatre of etiquette. And yet public appearances were only one piece of the puzzle. Once back inside the home, another world of restrictions awaited in the private rituals of family life, from how women were expected to raise children to the way they expressed grief and mourning. And when the street performance ended at the front door, a woman stepped into another arena of judgment, one that was supposedly private but no less regulated. Motherhood in the Victorian era was not treated as an instinct or a personal journey. It was treated as a moral duty, monitored and critiqued as carefully as posture or conversation. The child was not only a person to be raised but a reflection of the mother's refinement. A noisy baby, a dirty child, or a poorly mannered adolescent all reflected poorly on her character. The etiquette of motherhood began before birth. Manuals were filled with instructions for expectant mothers, urging them to maintain calm tempers, avoid overeating, and never indulge in excessive laughter. The belief was that a woman's emotional state would imprint itself on the unborn child. If she grew angry, the child might be born unruly. If she enjoyed too much excitement, the child might inherit nervousness. Pregnancy itself became another performance, one that demanded restraint at every moment. Once the child was born, the etiquette became stricter still. Mothers were told to maintain constant watch over the moral and physical cleanliness of their children. This meant immaculate clothing, spotless appearances, and polite behaviour at all times, even when poverty or circumstance made such standards unrealistic. Manuals warned mothers never to allow their children to be seen barefoot, never to let them shout too loudly, and never to let them show signs of disobedience in public. A misbehaving child could cause more social damage to a mother than any of her own actions. Discipline carried its own peculiar rules. Corporal punishment was common, but etiquette writers urged that it be done discreetly. A mother could discipline in private, but was warned never to raise her voice or strike a child in front of company. Public scolding was considered a failure of both maternal authority and self-control. Instead, mothers were encouraged to master the art of silent correction, guiding children with looks and gestures that reinforced obedience without breaking the illusion of composure. Even playtime was policed. Children were not meant to run wild or make noise. They were expected to engage in quiet, orderly activities that reflected refinement. Dolls and tea sets for girls, model soldiers and books for boys, but never chaotic games that dirtied clothing or raised voices. Mothers were judged on their ability to control the soundscape of the home, as though silence itself was proof of virtue. A household that echoed with laughter or shouts could be dismissed as common. Education was another burden placed on mothers. Etiquette manuals declared that the first lessons of manners had to come from the mother, who was expected to model and enforce refinement at every turn. Children were drilled in how to greet visitors, how to sit at the table, and how to speak without interruption. To fail in these duties risked being seen as negligent. Even wealthier women who employed governesses were expected to supervise and reinforce the rules themselves. Delegating responsibility did not free them from judgment. Mothers were also instructed to shield children from harsh realities. Talking openly about death, poverty, or sexuality was forbidden. Instead, they were to provide carefully curated versions of reality, wrapped in moral lessons and Christian virtues. The goal was not to raise independent thinkers, but to produce obedient, modest, and respectable adults who would carry forward the same system of rules. The irony was that many women, trapped in the system themselves, perpetuated it onto their children without ever questioning its absurdity. Historical evidence shows how pervasive these expectations were. Diaries of Victorian mothers reveal constant anxiety about whether they were doing enough. Letters between families discuss the behaviour of children with the same scrutiny given to adult reputations. Even magazines aimed at women printed regular reminders that motherhood was not a private bond but a public duty. To love your child was expected. To refine them into a perfect social actor was required. The absurdity deepens when you consider the double standard. Fathers were rarely scrutinised in the same way. A father could be distant or strict, and it was rarely blamed for a child's failings. But a mother bore the weight of every slip. If a child grew unruly, the mother was judged. If the child grew too quiet, she was also judged. The expectations were impossible to meet, yet women were told that perfection was the only acceptable outcome. Now picture yourself managing a household where every movement of your children is interpreted as a moral test. A spill at the dinner table is not just a spill. It is a signal to society that you lack refinement. A tantrum in public is not just frustration. It is evidence of maternal failure. You must smile, correct, and compose. all while ensuring that your children appear as flawless little mirrors of your own restraint. And even as you manage this exhausting role, another performance waits in the shadows. For when illness or tragedy struck, women faced yet another labyrinth of etiquette, one that dictated how they mourned, how long they wore black, and how their grief itself had to be staged with perfect composure. And when motherhood placed endless duties on your shoulders, there was still one more arena where etiquette tightened its grip: the rituals of death and mourning. Victorians turned grief into an industry, and women carried most of the burden. The simple act of losing a loved one was not only personal tragedy, it was a public performance where sorrow was measured by clothing, accessories, and the length of time one spent draped in black. Mourning dress was the most visible part of this ritual. A woman in mourning was expected to wear layers of black crepe, a stiff, dull fabric that absorbed light and seemed designed to announce misery at a glance. Unlike silk or satin, crepe could not be cleaned properly, which meant it quickly grew dusty and threadbare. Yet etiquette demanded that it be worn without fail. To appear in anything else risked whispers that you did not truly grieve. The mourning wardrobe was not optional, it was an obligation. The rules about timing were astonishingly detailed. Widows were expected to remain in full mourning for at least 2 years, sometimes longer, depending on family expectations. This meant black clothing from head to toe, including veils so long and heavy that women reported struggling to breathe or see through them. After the deeper stage of mourning, called full mourning, women could progress to half mourning, where shades of grey, lavender or mauve were permitted. These transitions were not personal choices, they were prescribed stages, as though grief followed a timetable printed in etiquette manuals. Even accessories were policed. Jewellery during mourning had to be subdued, often made of jet, a black fossilised wood popularised after Queen Victoria herself wore it, following the death of Prince Albert. Hair jewellery crafted from the locks of the deceased became another trend, with women wearing rings, brooches and pendants containing woven strands of their loved one's hair. To modern eyes, it might appear macabre, but in the Victorian era it was seen as both sentimental and proper. Social behaviour was equally constrained. Women in mourning were often discouraged from attending public events, balls, or theatres for extended periods. To appear in society too soon after a loss was condemned as heartless. Yet withdrawing entirely also carried risks, since women were expected to maintain certain social obligations. The balance was impossible, leaving women trapped between accusations of coldness on one side and impropriety on the other. The mourning period also dictated correspondence. Letters written during mourning were expected to be penned on black-bordered stationery, the thickness of the border signalling the degree of loss. A wide black band meant a close relative, while a thinner line indicated a more distant connection. Even grief had to be communicated in the correct font and frame, as though emotions required paperwork. Historical accounts describe how suffocating these customs became. Queen Victoria's decades-long mourning for Prince Albert reinforced the culture of excessive grief, setting a model that trickled down through society. Her refusal to abandon black clothing for 40 years turned the act into a national symbol, making it even harder for ordinary women to escape the expectations. What was already a social burden became entrenched tradition. The economic weight of mourning added insult to injury. Families often went into debt to purchase the required clothing and accessories, since failing to do so risked social shame. Middle-class women in particular struggled, forced to buy wardrobes that might never be worn again once the mourning period ended. Yet etiquette manuals made it clear that cost was no excuse. To wear inappropriate fabrics or colours, even out of necessity, was treated as a mark of disrespect to the dead. The absurdity of all this becomes clearest when you picture the daily reality. A woman swathed in thick layers of black crepe, veil obscuring her vision, trying to walk down a crowded street without tripping. The clothing trapped heat in summer, clung damply in rain, and gathered dust in dry weather. Yet she was expected to maintain perfect composure, never complaining, as though suffocation itself was part of honouring the departed. And even when the mourning period technically ended, its traces lingered. Women were encouraged to maintain a sombre dignity long after discarding their black garments, to laugh too freely, to dress too brightly, or to show eagerness for social life too soon was seen as disrespectful. Grief was transformed into a costume, and women were forced to play the role for as long as society demanded. Now imagine yourself carrying not only the weight of loss, but also the suffocating fabric of etiquette, every tear measured, every garment judged, every stage of grief mapped out like a public calendar. You're not free even in mourning. Your sorrow is choreographed, your clothing another script in the endless theatre of Victorian life. And beyond death itself, another strange category of rules awaited in the rituals of religion and morality, where women were expected to embody piety, modesty, and restraint in ways that went far beyond church pews and prayer books. And when grief wrapped itself in layers of black crepe, religion stepped in to ensure the performance never truly ended. Faith in the Victorian world was not only a private conviction, but a public obligation, and women bore the heaviest share of it. To be a respectable woman was to be visibly pious, to attend church, to pray with the right mixture of solemnity and grace, and to embody morality in a way that left no room for deviation. Church attendance was the most obvious marker. A woman was expected to appear weekly, dressed with precision that balanced modesty and refinement. Bright colours were discouraged, low necklines condemned, and even the angle of a bonnet could carry judgment. Arriving late was a sin not just against punctuality but against propriety. Manuals instructed women to enter quietly, never rushing, never letting skirts rustle too loudly, as though even fabric was capable of blasphemy. Seating inside the church reflected hierarchy as much as reverence. Wealthier families often rented pews, ensuring prominent placement near the pulpit, while poorer women were pushed to the back or into galleries. A woman's position in the church was less about devotion and more about the social message her seat conveyed. Even in worship, etiquette dictated rank. Prayer itself was another act weighed with etiquette. Kneeling too quickly was condemned as ungraceful, while remaining too still risked looking inattentive. Women were advised to fold their hands neatly, keep their eyes lowered, and avoid any displays that might seem excessive. Sincerity mattered less than restraint. A pious woman was not one who prayed the hardest, but one who prayed the most elegantly. Beyond the church walls, morality extended into every corner of daily life. Women were expected to embody purity and modesty, acting as moral compasses for their households. Manuals warned that a woman's reputation for piety could elevate or ruin her family's standing. To be caught gossiping too freely, dressing too boldly, or even laughing too loudly could invite accusations of frivolity or immorality. In a society obsessed with appearances, sin was often defined not by what you did, but by how others perceived you. Charity work became one of the few socially acceptable outlets for women outside the home, but even here etiquette reigned. Women were encouraged to visit the poor, distribute food, or organise church bazaars, but always with composure and modesty. Too much zeal was seen as unbecoming, while too little effort suggested coldness. The act of giving had to be performed with balance, a display of Christian virtue wrapped in lace gloves. Religious festivals and holidays added their own rituals. Easter demanded new clothing, a chance to display refinement within the bounds of respectability. Christmas brought expectations of charitable giving, carefully staged as demonstrations of moral duty. Even Lent became another measure of restraint, with women judged on how visibly they denied themselves pleasure. Faith was no longer just belief. It was a continuous audition for the role of virtue. The reach of moral etiquette extended even into literature and entertainment. Women were warned against reading novels deemed frivolous or scandalous. Manuals cautioned that the wrong book could corrupt the female mind, leading it astray from proper devotion. Reading aloud in mixed company was especially dangerous, as a woman's choice of passages could betray her character. A misstep in literature risked as much gossip as a misstep in posture. Historical accounts reveal just how pervasive this pressure became. Sermons often singled out women as the guardians of morality, praising them when they upheld the rules and condemning them when they did not. Newspapers printed stories of scandals where women's reputations unravelled after being spotted in the wrong company or failing to show appropriate piety. Faith, instead of being a source of comfort, became another tool of regulation. And the contradictions were endless. Women were urged to be modest, yet they were placed on pedestals as moral examples. They were told to be silent in public, yet blamed when households faltered. The demand for visible piety turned religion into another costume, worn as carefully as morning dress or ballroom gowns. To falter was to invite judgment not only from neighbours, but from entire congregations. Picture yourself kneeling on a hard church bench, corset cutting into your ribs, bonnet pressing against your forehead, hands folded in a precise angle, while the minister drones on. You're not free to shift too much, not free to whisper, not free to appear distracted. Every breath you take is weighed as evidence of your devotion, and when the service ends, you step back into a world where morality still clings to you, every action outside the church still judged by the same invisible standards. And yet beyond piety, another set of rules waited that were just as intrusive, regulating not how women prayed, but how they handled leisure, entertainment, and the fleeting possibility of enjoyment. And when the hymns faded and the pews emptied, the idea of leisure might seem like a reprieve, but in Victorian society relaxation came with its own iron cage of etiquette. Entertainment was never simply for pleasure, it was a moral test, a stage where every move was still scored for refinement. A woman at play was as scrutinised as a woman at prayer. Reading, one of the most popular pastimes, was tightly monitored. Novels in particular were viewed with suspicion. Etiquette manuals warned that frivolous or romantic novels could rot the female mind, filling it with dangerous ideas about independence or passion. Women were encouraged to read improving works, histories, moral tales, or religious tracts. If you wanted a bit of adventure, it had to come dressed as education. Even the act of reading had rules. Lounging with a book was considered slovenly. Instead, a lady should sit upright, spine straight, volume held neatly, as though the words themselves might be judged more favourably if read with correct posture. Music was another acceptable pastime, but it too was more duty than delight. Playing the piano was practically required for middle and upper class women, not as an outlet for creativity but as a display of refinement. Families invested heavily in pianos, expecting their daughters to perform during evening gatherings. But performance had limits. A woman was not to play for too long, nor choose pieces too complex lest she seem ostentatious. Manuals advised against excessive flourishes or showy bravado. Music was not for self-expression. It was for demonstrating discipline and modest accomplishment. Even outdoor leisure carried rules. Strolling in gardens or parks was encouraged, but always with composure. No running, no skipping, no unseemly displays of enthusiasm. Sporting activities were limited. Croquet became fashionable in the mid-19th century, but women were expected to play with restraint, never striking the ball too aggressively or celebrating too loudly. Bicycles, when they appeared later in the century, sparked heated debates about propriety. Some doctors claimed that the posture required for cycling was indecent for women. Others worried that the freedom of movement bicycles provided would corrupt morals. Simply sitting on a saddle became a subject of scandal. Theatre attendance was permitted but bound by etiquette. Women were expected to attend in company, properly dressed, and to maintain composure throughout. Laughing too freely or clapping too enthusiastically was frowned upon. Manuals advised women to keep their voices low even between acts. The theatre, instead of being a place for release, became another venue for performing refinement under the gaze of peers. Leisure in the home extended to sewing, embroidery, and painting. These pursuits were praised because they were quiet, controlled, and produced visible evidence of industriousness. A lady absorbed in embroidery was not wasting time. She was demonstrating virtue through needle and thread. The objects produced often decorated the household, serving as constant reminders of a woman's refinement. Even creativity was measured not by originality but by conformity to accepted patterns. The irony is that true leisure, the kind that allowed for rest, rarely existed. Manuals praised industriousness and warned against idleness at every turn. A woman who appeared to be doing nothing risked being labelled lazy or frivolous. Even in moments that should have been restful, women were expected to engage in suitable occupations, tasks that projected diligence rather than relaxation. The concept of leisure was reshaped until it looked suspiciously like more work. Historical accounts capture the strain of these expectations. Diaries mention exhaustion from endless rounds of music practice, embroidery, and carefully staged visits. Letters from young women reveal frustration at being denied novels they long to read, or at being forced to play the piano when they would rather rest. Yet these same sources show how deeply the rules were internalised. Women chastised themselves for failing to meet the standard, apologising for enjoying what little freedom they found. Picture yourself seated at the piano after an already long day, corset cinched tight, fingers pressing out a polite waltz while relatives nod approvingly. You dare not improvise, dare not lengthen the song, dare not let your enjoyment show too boldly. It is entertainment in name only, another rehearsal in the endless drama of etiquette. And even when leisure ended and the evening wound down, a woman's duties were not finished. Another set of rules governed how she prepared for rest itself, with etiquette extending all the way into the rituals of sleep, bedrooms, and the private spaces where one might imagine she could finally escape. And when the parlour games ended and the piano lid finally closed, you might imagine that at last a Victorian woman could retreat into privacy. Yet even the act of going to bed was shaped by rules, rituals, and expectations that made rest another stage in the performance of refinement. Sleep was supposed to restore, but etiquette ensured it became yet another burden. The bedroom itself was rarely private in the way we imagine today. In many middle and upper class households, servants came and went to stoke fires, tidy linens, or assist with dressing and undressing. A woman was expected to maintain composure even in her nightwear, never appearing sloppy or careless. Manuals recommended that women wear modest nightdresses, high-collared and long-sleeved, that protected dignity even in sleep. Lace and ribbons were acceptable, but exposure was not. The bedroom, instead of being a refuge, remained an extension of the parlour. The ritual of preparing for bed was almost ceremonial. Corsets, layered gowns, and petticoats had to be removed in stages, often with assistance. Hair was brushed meticulously, sometimes 100 strokes, a practice promoted as both hygienic and symbolic of discipline. Women were instructed to wash discreetly, using basins of water, since full bathing was not always possible. Even this act was framed as a moral duty. Cleanliness was not just about health, but about character. A woman who neglected her nightly routine was treated as morally lax, not merely untidy. Sleep itself carried rules. Manuals warned women against sprawling or snoring, both condemned as unladylike. To sleep too heavily was considered indolent, while waking too often suggested nervousness. Even unconscious behaviour was judged. Advice columns suggested that women cultivate graceful postures in bed, as though elegance should persist even while unconscious. It was a demand for refinement that extended into the one place no one could possibly control. Bedrooms were also judged by their contents. Visitors might be given tours of private chambers, and etiquette demanded that everything be in order. Bed linens had to be immaculate, nightstands arranged neatly, and personal items hidden away. A cluttered or disordered bedroom risked whispers about a woman's discipline. Even the mattress itself became a symbol. Featherbeds were preferred among the wealthy, while straw or flock mattresses betrayed lower status. Women bore responsibility for maintaining appearances, even in spaces never meant for public display. The absurdity stretched further into waking hours. Manuals instructed women to rise early, tidy themselves, and prepare for the day long before anyone saw them. to linger in bed was condemned as laziness. Diaries from the period show women rising before dawn to begin their duties, often after nights of restless or uncomfortable sleep. Yet society praised this exhaustion as virtue, as though denying rest was proof of refinement. Historical evidence underscores how deeply sleep was entwined with class and gender. Poorer women had little control over their sleeping conditions, often sharing beds in cramped rooms, yet were still judged against the same standards of refinement. Middle-class women laboured to maintain tidy bedrooms and proper routines, even when money or space was scarce. Upper-class women, though cushioned by wealth, endured endless rituals that made rest less restorative than performative. Across all levels, sleep was never entirely free. Picture yourself at the end of a long day, body aching from corset compression, hands sore from embroidery, ears ringing from parlour chatter. You long for rest, but instead you must brush your hair, cleanse with cold water, slip into a modest nightdress, and arrange yourself gracefully under heavy blankets. The fire crackles, the curtains drawn, yet the weight of etiquette lingers, pressing down even as your eyes close. Sleep, like every other part of life, has been claimed by the endless rules of Victorian womanhood. And once morning came, the cycle began again. Etiquette followed women not only into their bedrooms but into their very health, prescribing rules for diet, exercise, and even breathing, turning the female body itself into another arena of control. And when morning light slipped through heavy curtains, a Victorian woman woke not only to another day of performance, but to a body that society claimed as its own. Health was never treated as private. It was managed, judged, and reshaped by etiquette, until even the way a woman sat or drew breath was transformed into proof of refinement. Breathing was one of the first casualties. Corsets, drawn tight enough to reduce waists by several inches, restricted lung capacity so severely that fainting became a routine hazard. Yet instead of questioning the garment, etiquette manuals treated fainting as a graceful response, a ladylike swoon that confirmed delicacy. Women were warned never to gasp or wheeze too loudly when catching breath, since struggling openly with oxygen looked unrefined. Breathing had to be controlled, shallow and quiet, even when lungs cried for air. Diet was likewise policed. A woman's appetite was never her own. Eating heartily was condemned as coarse. Instead, women were instructed to cultivate restraint, nibbling at food in small, delicate bites. Medical advice of the period often reinforced these notions, promoting plain foods, modest portions, and a suspicion of spices or stimulants. Coffee, rich sauces, and even too much meat were blamed for unruly behaviour. Manuals recommended bread, broth, and vegetables, foods thought to keep women mild and controllable. A hungry stomach was not just ignored, it was praised as virtue. Exercise carried equal restrictions. While men embraced vigorous activities like hunting or rowing, women were urged toward gentler pursuits. Calisthenics, light stretching, and supervised walks were deemed acceptable, provided they did not raise sweat or risk muscular definition. A strong athletic body was viewed as unfeminine. Instead, pale skin and a fragile frame were celebrated, symptoms that might today signal ill health, but in the Victorian world suggested refinement. The irony was that this culture of delicacy often made women genuinely sick, yet illness itself was treated as proof of elegance. Hygiene too was framed less around health than etiquette. Full bathing was rare in many households, and women were told to rely on sponge baths and perfumes. Manuals praised the use of light colognes and floral waters, but warned against overindulgence, which might suggest vanity. Hair care became another battlefield. Women were expected to brush their hair hundreds of strokes each night, not only for cleanliness, but as a performance of discipline. To appear with unkempt hair risked whispers about moral laxity. Even illness came with rules. A woman who fell sick was expected to suffer quietly without complaint. Manuals stressed the importance of maintaining composure in front of visitors, never groaning or displaying discomfort. Too much noise suggested a lack of self-control. Even in bed, under fever or weakness, a woman was still judged for her grace. Visitors often reported on how beautifully or poorly a woman bore her illness, as though endurance were another test of refinement. The culture of invalidism grew from these pressures. Middle and upper-class women sometimes leaned into the role of the delicate invalid, spending long periods confined to fainting couches or bedrooms. Rather than being seen as weakness, this was framed as an extension of femininity, proof that a woman was too refined for the roughness of the world. Satirists mocked the phenomenon, yet it persisted, reinforced by both etiquette and medicine. Doctors often prescribed rest and fresh air, advice that sounded sensible but in practice kept women confined and passive. Historical accounts reveal how destructive these expectations became. Letters describe young women struggling with exhaustion, faintness, and chronic ailments, yet apologising for not appearing cheerful enough. Diaries mention hunger masked behind polite restraint, exercise denied out of fear of appearing unladylike, and endless routines of grooming disguised as healthcare. The body became a prison patrolled by rules, each one framed as refinement while slowly draining strength. Imagine waking from restless sleep, body sore from corsetry, stomach empty, lungs already pinched. Instead of nourishment and relief, you're expected to nibble politely, breathe delicately, move gracefully, and smile as though nothing is wrong. Illness is not a condition to recover from. It is another costume to wear convincingly, another role in the ceaseless theatre of Victorian womanhood. And beyond the body itself, the rules extended into the very rituals of communication. Letters, notes, and even the way women signed their names became part of etiquette, turning written words into yet another battlefield of refinement. Victorian society liked to imagine itself as a grand stage play, and women were cast into roles where every gesture, every glance, and every silence was directed by a manual thicker than most family Bibles. The irony was that this manual was never one single book. Instead, it came scattered across etiquette guides, sermons, newspapers, and whispered gossip, each one adding new restrictions until the female body itself became less a person and more a fragile instrument of social order. These rules were not simply suggestions for polite living. They were laws of survival in a world where stepping out of line meant ridicule, suspicion, or worse. Take conversation, for instance. It was never enough for a woman to speak. She had to master the art of speaking just enough, in the right tone, with the right vocabulary, and in the right company. Manuals urged women to keep their voices low and melodious, never shrill or argumentative, because too much confidence in speech was considered a masculine trait. The wrong word at a dinner table could make a woman seem uneducated or impertinent, while too much silence made her dull. Even laughter had its rules. A hearty laugh was indecent. Only a small, contained smile was acceptable, preferably hidden behind a gloved hand. Imagine the absurdity of a world where the sound of joy had to be dampened for fear of seeming uncouth. Posture was another battlefield. It was drilled into young women from an early age that their spines had to be rigid, their shoulders back and their heads held just so. Etiquette guides warned against leaning too heavily on furniture, against slouching, against sprawling in a chair. A lady was never to cross her legs, as this suggested a shocking lack of discipline. Instead, ankles were to be kept firmly together, toes pointed forward, and hands folded neatly in the lap. Sitting became less an act of rest and more an act of silent performance, where the body itself signalled virtue. Doctors later noted that this rigid posture, enforced by corsets and reinforced by etiquette, caused chronic back pain and limited mobility, but discomfort was treated as proof of refinement. The rules extended even to the streets. A woman walking outside was a woman on display, and the act itself came with an encyclopedia of prohibitions. She had to carry herself at a steady pace, never rushing, never loitering, never swinging her arms too freely. Her eyes were to remain cast modestly downward, avoiding direct stares at strangers, particularly men. To meet the gaze of a man on the street could brand a woman as flirtatious or worse, as one who belonged to the public women class. Gloves were mandatory for such excursions, as bare hands were considered scandalous, and heaven forbid a woman eat in public. Taking a simple bite of food on the street was viewed as behaviour bordering on vulgarity. Inside the home, the rules multiplied. A woman entertaining guests was expected to be the axis around which the entire household revolved, but her role was more decorative than authoritative. She was to smile at the right times, pour tea with studied grace, and guide conversation without appearing controlling. Serving tea itself was a ritualized performance. The teapot was to be held at just the right angle, sugar tongs managed delicately, and cups offered in order of rank. Manuals warned against splashing, spilling, or filling cups too full. The entire act became a metaphor for Victorian womanhood. Polished, contained, endlessly serving, but always restrained within invisible boundaries. Courtship added another layer of bizarre restrictions. A woman was never to appear eager, never to approach a suitor directly, never to initiate correspondence. Letters between unmarried men and women were tightly policed, often read by family members to ensure propriety. Even an innocent compliment could be twisted into a sign of moral failure. Etiquette books encouraged women to cultivate an appearance of passive charm, waiting quietly for the right suitor to declare himself. This waiting game often stretched for years, leaving young women in limbo, forbidden from showing interest yet expected to be perpetually available. Dress codes made the absurdity even more visible. The corset was only the most infamous of these demands. Gloves, parasols, hats, and endless layers of petticoats all became non-negotiable tools of etiquette. To appear without the proper accessories marked a woman as careless or even morally questionable. These items were not just fashion, they were surveillance tools in fabric and lace. The right gloves proved that a woman was respectable. The wrong hat suggested negligence. A misplaced button could be interpreted as a lapse in discipline. What we now think of as minor wardrobe malfunctions could, in Victorian society, define an entire reputation. Meals provided another gauntlet. A woman was not free to eat as her stomach demanded. She was trained to take small, delicate bites, never chewing too loudly, never showing too much appetite. Manuals instructed women on how to handle silverware, how to butter bread without appearing greedy, and how to refuse additional portions without insulting the host. Drinking soup required precision. Too loud a sip was uncivilized. Tilting the bowl toward oneself was clumsy. Every mouthful became a test of refinement. No wonder fainting couches were so popular. Many women were faint not from delicacy, but from chronic undernourishment, enforced by etiquette as much as by corsetry. Religion and morality layered still more rules on top. Sermons often framed obedience to etiquette as proof of piety. Women were told that their self-control, their modesty and their silence were not only social virtues but divine duties. A woman who transgressed etiquette was not merely rude, she was painted as unholy. In a culture that fused morality with manners, these rules gained supernatural weight, making rebellion not just socially dangerous but spiritually damning. And perhaps most absurdly, even illness carried an etiquette of its own. A sick woman was expected to suffer quietly, never groaning, never appearing too distressed. To faint gracefully was acceptable, to moan loudly was not. Visitors judged not only the sickness itself, but how well the woman endured it. Endurance without complaint was seen as evidence of moral character, turning private pain into yet another public performance. This culture produced what historians call the cult of invalidism, where upper and middle-class women sometimes leaned into the identity of the frail invalid, trapped in endless cycles of rest cures and fainting spells, because society celebrated weakness as femininity. At every turn, the rules ensured that women were never free from scrutiny. From the way they sat, spoke and walked, to the way they ate, dressed and even suffered illness, Everything was subject to evaluation. The constant monitoring turned daily life into a theatre of restraint, with women as unwilling actors under the spotlight of social judgment. What is astonishing is not simply the absurdity of the rules, but how successfully they convinced women to police themselves and each other. Generations internalized these restrictions until obedience became second nature, a silent inheritance passed down with every lesson in posture or every whispered warning about laughter too loud. Victorian etiquette promised refinement but delivered surveillance. It turned bodies into symbols, voices into whispers, and appetites into sins. What it really created was a system of invisible chains, enforced not by guards or prisons, but by manuals, gossip, and the constant threat of scandal. And when the curtain rose on yet another day of this exhausting performance, a Victorian woman found herself trapped once more, moving through rituals so rehearsed that breaking them was unthinkable. Victorian etiquette did not stop at posture or polite conversation. It invaded the most private corners of life, transforming even the act of writing a letter or arranging furniture into a matter of reputation. To modern eyes, these rules seem microscopic in their absurdity, but in the 19th century they carried enormous weight. A single misplaced phrase in a letter could ruin a courtship. A chair angled incorrectly in the parlor could make a family look uncultured. Women were made custodians of these invisible details, expected to guard the household's honor with a vigilance that bordered on obsession. Take correspondence, for example. A letter was not simply a note. It was a mirror of character, judged as carefully as a public speech. Women were taught to avoid blots of ink, to keep margins straight, and to write in a legible but modest hand. Flourishes or bold strokes were considered aggressive, unladylike. One etiquette manual warned that even the choice of stationery revealed a woman's refinement. Pale blue paper was fashionable, but anything too brightly coloured could hint at frivolity. The folding of the letter mattered too. To crease unevenly suggested a lack of discipline, while too much perfume on the paper risked accusations of vanity. Some manuals went so far as to instruct women on how many exclamation points were permissible, as if excessive enthusiasm might betray moral weakness. The ritual extended into how letters were sent and received. A woman should never dispatch a letter by common hand if it could be avoided, as this might lower its dignity. The sealing wax was to be pressed firmly, yet not so ostentatiously as to appear proud. And once received, a letter had to be answered promptly. To delay was an insult, yet to respond too quickly could be read as eagerness, which in courtship was unacceptable. The entire process turned communication into a delicate dance where every gesture risks censure. Then there was the matter of calling cards, one of the strangest social inventions of the Victorian world. A small rectangle of stiff paper carried the full weight of a woman's social identity. When visiting another household, a lady would leave her card on a silver tray in the entrance hall. The way it was folded, or whether it bore only her name or included her husband's, communicated volumes. A turned-down corner could signal a condolence visit. A card folded lengthwise might indicate a personal call, while folded widthwise it suggested a more formal one. Forgetting to leave a card or failing to return another could ignite feuds that lasted months. In essence, the household tray of calling cards became a minefield where women manoeuvred with constant caution. Etiquette even reached into how women were expected to furnish and decorate their homes. The parlor in particular was scrutinized as an extension of a woman's character. Manuals advised against overcrowding the space, warning that too many trinkets signaled vulgarity, while too few suggested a lack of refinement. Curtains were to be drawn at the proper angle, not so tightly as to make the house seem gloomy, not so open as to invite the gaze of strangers. Flowers were encouraged but had to be arranged in specific ways, since certain blossoms carried moral symbolism. Lilies might suggest purity, roses hinted at romance, and too much ivy could be read as clinging neediness. Imagine trying to arrange a vase while worrying that your choice of petunias might label you frivolous in the eyes of your neighbours. Table manners, already strict, could verge on the surreal. At a formal dinner, women were instructed never to eat the last morsel on a shared dish. To do so implied greed. One manual advised that a lady should never lift food directly to her mouth with her fingers unless it was bread, and even then she must break the bread into small pieces first. Fruit required a whole arsenal of special cutlery, with knives, forks and spoons designed for grapes, melons, and even strawberries. Using the wrong implement branded a woman as uncultured, no matter how wealthy she might be, and under no circumstance was a woman to season her food at the table. To reach for the salt cellar suggested that the cook had erred, which reflected poorly on the hostess. Thus taste itself was subordinated to etiquette, forcing women to eat in silence rather than admit a dish was bland. Public transportation created new challenges. With the expansion of railways and omnibuses, women were expected to master a set of travel manners that would make modern commuters laugh. A lady should never travel without a chaperone if she could avoid it. If she entered a railway carriage, she had to be careful not to seat herself beside a stranger of questionable appearance. Manuals recommended that women carry a shawl or small rug to spread over the seat before sitting, both for modesty and cleanliness. Speaking loudly in a carriage was frowned upon, as was staring out the window for too long, which might imply idle daydreaming. Even the handling of luggage was considered a point of etiquette. A woman was expected to manage her small bags gracefully, leaving heavier trunks to male porters. Even sneezing came under scrutiny. One guide insisted that women should never produce a loud sneeze, and that if it occurred, it must be subdued with a handkerchief raised discreetly. Blowing one's nose was to be done as silently as possible, preferably in private. To draw attention to bodily functions of any kind was deemed grossly unfeminine. This obsession with bodily control extended to coughing, yawning, and even sighing. Each had to be minimized, contained, and cloaked in politeness, until women themselves seemed less human and more like carefully wound automata designed to mimic refinement. Charitable behavior carried its own codes. Philanthropy was one of the few socially sanctioned outlets for female energy, yet even this was bound by etiquette. Women were encouraged to support orphanages, hospitals, and poor relief, but they had to do so in a way that did not appear too assertive. A woman who organised too forcefully risked seeming domineering, while one who gave too little appeared stingy. Even kindness had to be balanced within the scales of social judgment, proving that in the Victorian world no action was exempt from the etiquette microscope. The ultimate absurdity, however, may have been the rules surrounding introductions. A woman could not introduce herself to strangers. She had to wait to be introduced by a mutual acquaintance, and the order of introduction was itself bound by hierarchy. A younger woman was always introduced to an older one, never the reverse. A woman of lower status was presented to one of higher standing. Mismanaging an introduction could create lasting insult. Imagine living in a world where even saying your own name in public without the right mediator was considered a breach of civilization. All of these rules reveal something important about Victorian society. Etiquette was less about politeness and more about control. It was a system designed to reinforce class, gender, and morality, all disguised as manners. Women carried the heaviest burden of this system, not because they were naturally less polite, but because society used etiquette to limit their freedom at every turn. To exist in this world was to live inside an invisible cage, padded with lace and softened with perfume stationery, but a cage nonetheless. What makes it fascinating today is the sheer detail of this control. We marvel at how many hours Victorian women spent learning to pour tea or practicing how to fold a letter, but beneath the humour lies a reminder of how social rules can become chains. These rules may no longer dictate the angle of a curtain or the size of a bite, but the obsession with image and appearance remains familiar. The Victorians simply perfected the art of disguising surveillance as civility, turning everyday life into a relentless performance judged by the eyes of others. And that about wraps up tonight's polite descent into Victorian absurdity. If you enjoyed this little stroll through the land of lace gloves, calling cards, and socially acceptable sneezing, let me know in the comments what bizarre slice of history you'd like me to unravel next. Maybe medieval dental care, maybe pirate laundry day, maybe something even worse. If you enjoy listening to the endless parade of historical suffering, be sure to check out my other videos. There's no shortage of lice, chamber pots or etiquette manuals waiting to tuck you in. Now get some rest. You've earned it.